Hi everyone, I'm Matt at DCA for Sofia WUDC this year, and this video is going to step through the manual changes that we've made to counter models. We're going to assume a baseline of knowledge about the pre-existing rules for counter models, so that means I'm not going to be providing a full re-explanation for how counter modeling works as it has been laid out in previous manuals and as it has been practiced in the community. I'm going to be very specifically focusing on our new changes. I want to make two notes at the top of this video before getting into it. The first thing to note is that some people might consider these to be rule changes, and other people might just consider them to be clarifications that reinforce the rules that they were already using. Throughout the process of drafting this manual, we discovered that there were pretty large discrepancies between different circuits and members of the community in terms of how they interpreted the rules pertaining to counter models. So some people were already enforcing the rules that I'm about to lay out, either through particular interpretations or readings of other rules, which allowed them to imply the existence of the rules that I'm about to spell out, or simply on the basis of what seemed like a kind of reasonable countermodel. The intention of these changes is to universalize those rules so that they can be enforced by everyone in a relatively consistent way. The second thing I want to note is with respect to structure. I'm going to structure this around the two key changes that we've made, with brief reference to a third clarification we've made around alternatives, just because that's necessary to illustrate the implications of one of the first two rule changes. At each juncture, I'm going to endeavor to provide the actual text of the manual so you can understand exactly what tests you'll be applying to determine if something is or is not a legitimate countermodel. So we've provided more or less three tools to help you interpret the manual. The first is the actual text of the rule that you will be applying. The second is some examples of countermodels which are permitted under the rules and some which are not permitted, which should help you figure out where the dividing line sits. And thirdly, we've provided some specific notes on interpretation where we felt it's necessary. The actual text of the rule is always going to be open to interpretation with respect to specifically where certain thresholds of permissibility sit. But it's hoped that those examples and those specific notes on interpretation will help to illustrate approximately where judges should be drawing the relative line. With that out of the way, I'm going to be talking about two rule changes. Firstly, our changes to the rules concerning whether countermodels are related to the motion. And secondly, our changes with respect to the convertibility of resources. So the first change that we've made is that the countermodel must be related to the same broad policy area as the motion. Directly from the manual, the text is, counterprops must also be related to one of the same broad policy areas as the OG model. While we can't perfectly discretize motions or models into policy areas, it's clear that we discuss both actual public policy and debating motions in the context of them having a topic or a policy area. And additionally, for the purposes of this section, we actually don't need to draw perfect boundaries between topic or policy areas in the full universe of all motions. We only need to consider two models and whether they are closely enough related that they could be reasonably considered to be in the same policy or topic area. However, given that the lines between that can be somewhat murky, we've provided further guidance for interpretation that where there's uncertainty arising from that murkiness, judges should be permissive and should allow the countermodel. The text from the manual reads, while policy areas are not perfectly defined, judges can make reasonable assessments that policies fit into particular categories, e.g. education, health. Given that these areas are not perfectly delineated from one another, judges should not be overly restrictive in how they interpret what counts as being in the same broad policy area. To further aid your interpretation, we've provided a further rule of thumb that countermodels which are intuitively related to the motion should be permitted. The full text from the manual reads, as a general rule, where the OO team proposes a reasonable countermodel which is intuitively related to the motion, it should be permitted. We've also covered the edge case where a model or a motion is related to two topic areas to a substantial degree. The full text from the manual reads, if the original policy was aimed at multiple policy areas to a substantial degree, the countermodel need only target one of them. Finally, we've provided examples of where countermodels are and are not closely enough related to the motion to be permissible. That helps illustrate where the line sits between the two. The example is from the manual. On the motion, this house would ban the sale of junk food. We would put a tax on junk food, is permissible because it's closely enough related to the motion. We would use all of the money that would be spent on enforcing the ban to grow our nuclear arsenal to increase the nuclear deterrent would be impermissible because it is not closely enough related to the motion. So the conclusion of all of that is that countermodels not related to the same policy area as the motion are not permitted. However, if this rule restricts you from using your counterfiat to explain what would happen in the counterfactual, that is, what would happen in the absence of the motion, you may choose not to implement a countermodel and instead to make an argument that if this motion did not happen, the most likely thing that would happen instead is something else. These were previously known as alternatives. Teams were allowed to suggest alternative things that would happen in the absence of the motion and then prove with likelihood analysis that those would happen. However, if we examine the burden for a judge to credit such an alternative, they are indistinct from simply making an argument. That is, if the burden for the judge to believe an alternative is true is that you must prove it is likely and you cannot use counterfiat, then that is the burden that exists for all arguments. You must prove that they are likely to happen in the absence of the motion. We've therefore clarified in the manual that these alternatives are simply arguments teams make about what would occur in the counterfactual. Give an example to illustrate this. In the motion, this house would engage in space exploration. You could not countermodel that the money would instead be spent on some given social welfare policy, as that is clearly in breach of the rule about countermodels being related to the same broad policy area as the motion. However, you could argue from OO that in the absence of space exploration, governments would have more money, and likely some of that money would go to whatever social welfare policy you wanted to argue about. However, in that case, how the government spends the money counterfactually is a question within the debate that's subject to likelihood analysis, not something that the OO team can countermodel in. So hopefully that illustrates how you can use alternatives that are actually just arguments if you do not have the counterfiat for what you would like to suggest happens on the counterfactual. That's the first rule change. The second rule change that we've made is with respect to the convertibility of resources. Countermodels must use the same or fewer resources as the OG model, as they always have. However, no two models ever use exactly the same resources. The public will is always slightly different. You will need slightly different labor or slightly different materials or whatever. The question therefore becomes, how convertible are the resources between types of resources such that you are still using the same or less resources? We have clarified you cannot convert resources between type for the counter model. You must not only use the same or fewer resources on net, but also the same or fewer of each type of resource. But then that creates the same question one level down. What constitutes a type of resources that cannot be converted between? For the Sofia manual, we've defined those categories and those types with respect to the convertibility test. Resources are not of the same type and cannot be converted between unless they can be easily converted between in the vast majority of circumstances. The full text from the manual reads, opposition countermodels must not only use the same or fewer resources on net, but must also use the same or less of each type of resource. Whether a resource is of the same type as another is defined by whether the two resources could be converted into each other easily in the vast majority of circumstances. Once again, I want to note that for the vast majority of countermodels, it should be obvious and intuitive that the resources are easily convertible. And if you're having to provide a lot of likelihood analysis or explain a complicated and contingent pathway through which these resources are convertible, it's likely that the countermodel is not permissible and the resources are of different types. This is not to say you can't explain to a judge that the resources in question are in fact convertible. You're allowed to try to explain to a judge that the resources are convertible and therefore that your countermodel is legitimate. However, the burden on such an argument is to show that these resources can, in the vast majority of circumstances, be easily converted between one another, such as to be effectively in the same category of resources. The burden is not just to show that on the balance of probability, they could be converted between in this particular instance. This should, in the vast majority of circumstances, be uncontentious. This manual change exists to stop reasonably clear cases where OO, for instance, tries to argue that they can convert OG's public will into money and spend it on something else. We have once again provided examples of what are permissible and impermissible countermodels to help illustrate where the line sits. From the manual, in the motion this House would legalize marijuana, saying from OO, we will take all of the public will saved by not legalizing marijuana and set up new clinics to deal with drug addiction is not permissible because you can't convert the public will into money easily in the vast majority of circumstances. This house would hire significantly more police officers. If the op says, we will instead redirect all of the money OG would use on police officers to hire social workers instead, that is a permissible countermodel because it's easy to see how you could spend less money on one thing and spend it on another. At the end of all of that, resources are not convertible between types for the purposes of a countermodel, and you must use the same or less of each type of resource for a countermodel to be legitimate, with whether or not two resources are of the same type being defined by whether you could easily convert between those two resources in the vast majority of circumstances. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and good luck for Sofia WUDC.